Let's begin with something many of us overlook: the silent presence of objects in our home and the role they play in shaping our mental, emotional, and even spiritual state. We think of our homes as shelters, places of rest, privacy, and familiarity. But what if I told you that within your home, maybe even within the room you're sitting in right now, there are objects that don't just take up space, but influence the very atmosphere of your life, and not positively. You see, every object carries a kind of imprint. This isn't just mystical talk. It's deeply psychological. Carl Jung spoke of the unconscious residue that lingers in spaces and things, impressions left behind by past experiences, unresolved emotions, or spiritual dissonance. Just as our memories are stored in the recesses of the mind, memories, energies, are stored in objects. Some uplift us, but others pull us down, subtly and persistently. And most of us have no idea it's happening. Think for a moment about the chair in the corner no one ever sits in, or that old photo on the wall that reminds you of a time you thought you had healed from, or the antique mirror that once belonged to someone who lived a life full of turmoil. These things might appear harmless, but under the surface, they contribute to the energy of your home like instruments in an orchestra. The problem arises when some of those instruments are out of tune, dissonant, jarring, disruptive. We don't often consider the psychological weight of the objects we surround ourselves with. But studies in environmental psychology show that our surroundings can either support our mental clarity or erode it. Clutter increases stress. Certain colors and shapes can trigger anxiety. Objects associated with trauma or unresolved relationships can keep us stuck in cycles of emotional stagnation, even when we believe we've moved on. The philosopher Martin Heidegger once said that objects gather the world around them. What does that mean? It means that a single object doesn't exist in isolation. It gathers meaning, emotion, memory, and association. A letter from a person who betrayed you. A souvenir from a place where something painful happened. A gift from someone whose intentions were not pure. These items are not just things. They are anchors. And the question is, what are they anchoring you to? Now, this isn't about paranoia or superstition. This is about awareness, about discernment. It's about learning to walk through your space with open eyes and a discerning spirit. You begin to ask, does this object add to my peace, my purpose, my clarity? If the answer is no, why is it still here? What is it doing in your home, in your field of vision, in your energy? We must come to a place where we realize that every item we allow into our space is either a servant or a saboteur. It either helps build the light in your life, or it opens the door to darkness, not just in the spiritual sense, but in the psychological, emotional, and even physical realm. The chaos you feel may not always be coming from within you. Sometimes it's simply being mirrored back at you by the objects you've allowed to remain too long. So before we go any further in this message, I urge you, take inventory. Not just of your thoughts, not just of your behaviors, but of your belongings. Walk through your home like someone reclaiming sacred ground, because that's what your home should be, sacred. And if there are objects in your space that no longer align with the light you're trying to walk in, then they have no place in your life. Now, once we begin to understand that objects carry energy, the next step is to examine how disorder, simple, everyday clutter, acts as a magnet for darkness. This isn't just about cleanliness. It goes much deeper than the surface. You can have a house that appears clean and still be spiritually congested. Because clutter is not just physical mess, it's symbolic. It reflects what's happening in the deeper levels of the soul. We often live with things we no longer need, want, or even like, and yet we keep them. Why? Because of fear, because of memory, because of procrastination. And every item that lingers without purpose adds weight to our inner world. Walk through any cluttered space and you'll notice something peculiar. Your breathing tightens. Your mind becomes scattered. Your focus weakens. That's not just coincidence. That's environment shaping consciousness. You see, order is not a luxury. It's a spiritual principle. It's foundational. Even in the opening verses of Genesis, before creation fully unfolded, Scripture says the earth was formless and void, chaotic. And what did the Spirit of God do? It moved. It brought order out of chaos. Separation, clarity, design. That's the nature of light. And that same principle applies to your home. Clutter does the opposite. It welcomes confusion. It creates blind spots. Have you ever noticed how hard it is to make clear decisions when you're surrounded by mess? It's not by accident. The external world is always echoing the internal one, and vice versa. When we tolerate disarray in our space, we unconsciously give permission for disorder to persist in our emotions, our relationships, and even in our sense of purpose. Think about this. A drawer stuffed with old receipts, broken batteries, expired medicine, and tangled cords. It may seem small, but it carries a kind of symbolic inertia. It represents delayed decisions, things you've been avoiding, fragments of the past that you haven't released. And those fragments accumulate. They become barriers. Spiritually, emotionally, mentally. They start to block flow. Why do so many people feel stuck, as though something invisible is holding them back? It's often not some great external enemy. It's these subtle weights hiding in plain sight. A home filled with purposeless objects is like a soul filled with unresolved tension. And where there's tension, there's no peace. Where there's no peace, there's no clarity. And where there's no clarity, darkness thrives. Even the act of cleaning and decluttering is more than practical. It's prophetic. You're making a declaration to your environment. This is what I will no longer accept. And that kind of declaration begins to stir things up. It shifts your energy. It clears space not just on the floor or on the shelves, but in your spirit. New ideas come, new courage, sometimes even new relationships, all because you created room. Some might say, it's just stuff. But I would say, no, it's never just stuff. It's a reflection. And the home reflects the soul. A cluttered home is a cluttered heart. A cluttered heart is easily overwhelmed, easily confused, and vulnerable to influence, not always from outside forces, but from the noise within. And if you want to drive out darkness, you don't start with a shout, you start with a sweep. So take a hard look at every corner, every drawer, every shelf. Ask yourself, is this helping me walk in light, or is it anchoring me to disorder? And if it's the latter, don't hesitate. Remove it. Now that we've looked at the energy of objects and the weight of clutter, let's turn our attention to something that most people don't think twice about, and yet it has one of the strongest influences on the atmosphere of a home. I'm talking about mirrors. Yes, mirrors. They hang silently on our walls, sit atop vanities, or lean in corners like passive bystanders. But let me tell you, mirrors are not passive. They are active participants in the flow of energy, perception, and even spiritual atmosphere in your space. From a purely psychological perspective, mirrors reflect more than our image. They reflect our mood, our posture, our state of being. And they do it constantly, without rest. Now, when a mirror is placed without intention, especially in key positions, such as directly facing a door or directly facing a bed, It begins to disrupt the natural flow of peace. The home, like the human soul, needs a rhythm, a balance between stillness and motion, light and shade, openness and protection. A mirror in the wrong place can interrupt that rhythm. Let me explain. When a mirror faces the front door, it reflects energy outward. In other words, the moment something positive enters your home, a peaceful visitor, a hopeful decision, even a good night's sleep waiting at the end of a long day, that mirror sends it right back out. It repels rather than receives. And when a mirror faces the bed, it creates unrest. You may not even realize it, but your mind registers the movement, the subtle reflections during the night, even in darkness. It invites wakefulness, anxiety, restlessness. And if you're spiritually sensitive, you'll often notice increased dreams, confusion, even oppression in your sleep. These effects aren't superstition. They're rooted in how the human psyche responds to reflection and movement. The mind is always interpreting, always absorbing. And when there's a mirror reflecting the door where energy enters, or the bed where your spirit is most vulnerable, it introduces a duplicity, a fragmentation. You don't rest, you don't receive, you don't settle. The ancient world understood this. Mirrors were never taken lightly. They were seen as portals, as gateways between realms. Not just because of the way they look, but because of what they represent: reflection, perception, sometimes distortion. And what is darkness if not a distortion of light? We live in an age where design has replaced discernment. People place mirrors for style, to make a room look bigger or brighter. But bigger isn't always better. Brighter isn't always holier. What you need is harmony. A home that flows like water, not bounces like static. A mirror that reflects light thoughtfully is a blessing. But a mirror that scatters peace, that interrupts sacred spaces, is an open invitation to disorder. If you've been struggling with sleep, with heaviness when you walk through the door, with a feeling that something's just not quite right, consider where your mirrors are. Cover them for a few nights. Shift their position. Remove the one that faces your bed. Observe what changes. You might be surprised how quickly the atmosphere begins to settle. Because the goal here is not just to beautify a home. It's to sanctify it. To make it a place where light doesn't just pass through, but dwells. And anything that disrupts that, even something as common as a mirror, must be dealt with. Now, there's something else I need to say, and it may hit a little closer to home. We've talked about the energy of objects, the chaos of clutter, the disruption of mirrors. But perhaps nothing holds more hidden weight in your home than the items tied to painful or toxic relationships. These are the things we keep, not because they serve us, but because they remind us. And that right there is the danger. You see, the human heart has a strange attachment to pain. We say we've moved on. We say we've healed. We say it's in the past. And yet, there it is, the gift from the person who betrayed you. The shirt left behind by someone who walked out. The photo from a time you no longer belong to. We leave them on shelves, tucked in boxes, sometimes right out in the open. Why? Because a part of us still wants to hold the memory, even when that memory holds us hostage. And let me be clear, it's not just emotional. It's spiritual. Objects from broken relationships carry the residue of that connection. And if the connection was built on manipulation, betrayal, control, fear, that residue doesn't go away when the person does. It lingers. It clings. And what clings begins to influence. That's why you can be in a new season, trying to move forward, but still feel stuck, still feel watched, still feel like part of you is living in yesterday. Because part of you is, Philosophers have long understood the concept of the extended self, that our identity extends into the objects we possess. William James, the father of modern psychology, even argued that our possessions are part of who we are. So when you keep something tied to a toxic relationship, you're not just keeping a thing, you're keeping a thread. And that thread pulls. It may not pull hard, it may not pull loud, but it pulls. That's why certain rooms feel heavier than others. That's why you can walk past a drawer or a shelf and feel a tension you can't quite name. Because your soul remembers what your mind has tried to forget, and the objects remain as silent witnesses. They don't speak, but they echo. They echo every argument, every wound, every unfinished ending. Let me ask you, why keep what reminds you of who you're no longer becoming? Why decorate your life with symbols of suffering, regret, or brokenness? You are not a museum for past pain. You are a temple for present light, and temples don't keep relics of the defiled. They purge them. I've seen people burn letters, throw out jewelry, repaint entire rooms just to reclaim their peace. And you know what? It works. Not because the fire is magical, not because the trash can is holy, but because the act itself is prophetic. It says, I am done giving space to what broke me. It's a line in the sand. It's a moment of clarity. And clarity, as we've said before, invites light. Maybe you're thinking, but it was a gift, but it was expensive, but I've had it for years. Let me tell you something, nothing is worth more than your peace. Not a ring, not a picture, not a note. If it ties you to pain, it has no place in your sanctuary. So walk through your home with fresh eyes. Find those emotional anchors. And when you find them, don't hesitate. Let them go. As we continue this journey through the home, this sacred space that reflects the condition of the soul, I want you to pause and consider something that might seem harmless, even decorative: your plants. Yes, plants. You see, not all darkness enters in the form of something loud or frightening. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in stillness, in decay. A dying plant on your windowsill, a wilted bouquet left too long, a dusty artificial arrangement gathering cobwebs in the corner. These things don't just represent neglect. They represent a message, one you may not have realized you were preaching to yourself every day. Something is not growing here. Now, I'm not saying every plant must bloom perfectly, or that having fake flowers is some grave offense. That's not the point. What I'm drawing your attention to is the symbolism, because your environment constantly speaks, and the subconscious is always listening. A dead plant says, life has left this place. A fake one says, there's the appearance of growth, but no real root. And if you surround yourself with enough of those messages, they begin to seep into the way you think, into what you expect, into what you tolerate. You walk past the withered fern day after day, telling yourself you'll water it, you'll fix it, you'll replace it. But you don't. Why? Because it's become normal. And that, my friend, is the real danger. Not the plant itself, but the normalization of lifelessness. We get used to things that aren't thriving. We get comfortable with signs of neglect. And then that mindset leaks into other areas of life. Relationships, dreams, health, faith. Before long, we're not just living among dead things, we're thinking like them. Expecting less, accepting decay. You see, nature was God's first temple. Before there was a tabernacle, before there was stone or structure,